In case you somehow missed all of the rainbows, it is Pride Month, a time when Americans are expected to express their support of all things LGBTQIASS plus, etc. Here's how this is being celebrated at the Department of Defense.
The LGBTQ plus Americans we recognize and celebrate today. They represent a community of Americans who are among the most vulnerable in every category our society measures. Safety from violence, education, housing, employment, healthcare.
That was Sean Skelly, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Readiness and the highest ranking openly trans defense official, speaking at the Defense Department's 11th annual Pride Month celebration on Monday. So as we go through this month, what should Christians remember about Pride Month? That's the focus of an article I wrote this week for Washington Stand, last week, in fact, and that's the topic of today's Biblical Worldview discussion with my colleague, David Closson, the director of FRC's Center for Biblical Worldview. David, good to see you today.
Hey, great to see you and great to be back on with you, Joseph.
Well, it's been a minute as we have been traipsing around to our various our travels, but it's good to see you as well. And this is an important conversation. And before I get into this subject of how Christians should respond to this, I want to talk a bit about kind of the victim status. And there's a story that came out of Major League Baseball this week that I believe you saw. I assume you're going to say you saw, and if you didn't, I'll tell you about it. The Tampa Bay Devil Rays, because they had a Pride Night, as so many companies do. I don't think every team does, but they had a Pride Night. And as part of Pride Night, they modified their team logo that would go on the uniforms to incorporate the rainbow. And there were several players on that team who objected to that. And of course, then there were people who objected to their objection, and we know how this thing goes. But it occurs to me that the rainbow, we all know, is a highly controversial political symbol, right? And I don't think it's a stretch to compare it to like the GOP logo or the NRA logo or a cross or a crescent moon or a symbol that represents something very specific that may be near and dear to some people, but may not be near and dear to other people. Why is it that the Tampa Bay Devil Rays would feel comfortable asking their players to put that particular divisive logo on their bodies, on their uniforms, but wouldn't dream of doing that with some other kind of logo?
Yeah, you're right. They wouldn't, Joseph. And being from Orlando, my favorite baseball team growing up was the Tampa Bay Devil Rays, who have since become the Rays, actually. So I grew up going to a lot of Rays games. And I think the question you're asking, it's important. I think it's, I think this is the 16th year in a row that they've done this. And I think kind of the cultural elites, those who run big business and big tech, Hollywood, the media, the list goes on. They've almost, the bubbles that they live in is just that this has become so culturally accepted that I assume the administrators at the Tampa Bay Rays, they didn't even think this would be controversial probably when they put this edict out for the players. But what's interesting is a lot of these ball players, they're Catholic, a lot of them are Christian, they come from Hispanic countries. And a couple of the players just articulated it so well that this was something that they thought was a step beyond what Major League Baseball and their organization could tell them to do because it violated their deeply held beliefs. And you're right, Joseph, the Rays wouldn't have dreamed of having them put an NRA, slogan on their jersey. But again, it shows in one sense how out of touch a lot of the elites are, just with a lot of Americans who do feel that this is being pushed down their throat every single day.
The LGBT lobby continues in Pride Month and the rest of the year, frankly, as well, to assert that they are marginalized, that they are victims of all sorts of things. And individually, to be sure, that is true. But as a movement, they claim that we are essentially the marginalized. Yeah. But when you can get people to do things for you that they wouldn't dream of doing for anyone else, is that the moment at which you have to kind of turn in your victim card?
I think so, Joseph. It's interesting. What are we in right now? We are in Pride Month. I read something earlier, Martin Luther King Jr., he gets 1 day. Independence gets 1 day. Thanksgiving gets 1 day. And we now have the entire month of June where we're expected to display rainbow decals and fly rainbow flags. And so I think you're right. It was Carl Truman in his article in World Magazine. He said, what we're seeing really is a comprehensive attempt at cultural revolution. When you get to that point, it is increasingly, it just seems absurd to try to say that there's to play the victim card, when really anyone who dissents is the one who's ridiculed and said that you're a bigot, you're outdated, and you're somehow subversive.
Yeah. And to put a fine point on this part of the conversation, it remains true that the LGBT community is it's disadvantaged in significant ways, specifically when you look at the transgender community. The rates of suicide are real, the rates of mental health. This is a truly troubled community where there are individual people who've experienced tremendous pain, are broken in many ways, and deserve a lot of compassion and need a lot of help. So there are individuals, to be sure, who require compassion and help and assistance. But when it comes to this larger, the group identity they try to claim and the claim of political powerlessness that they assert as a way of trying to get cultural sympathy, in fact, it's one of the politically most powerful, if not the politically most powerful group of people in America today, collectively, punching far above their weight in terms of their representation within the general public. But let's move on to our next subject here. And I want to get in with you, David. I just think that's a helpful context. But Christians are navigating this situation, and everybody in there, depending on what school they're in or what their corporate environment is, they're being asked in various ways to participate in this. And a lot of Christians find this to be hostile. And the first question I want to ask you is whether Christians should be surprised by that when they find themselves in a hostile environment where the people around them are doing things that they just don't feel comfortable with.
I don't think so, Joseph, and I think, as those of us who are Christians and we read our Bibles, especially we read our New Testament, we read what Jesus teaches. I think, it was actually the article that you put that we have on frc.org/worldview. It was the second point you made. You said, being a Christian is supposed to feel weird. And I think, as those of us who follow Jesus actually, you read the Gospel of John. And those final couple of chapters 13 through 17, Jesus' final teaching to his disciples. And it's remarkable to me, Joseph, that in chapters 15 and 16, Jesus spends a remarkable amount of that space. Again, he only has a few more moments with his disciples, and so what he chooses to spend his time on should be of a lot of importance to us. And in 15 and 16, he spends a lot of time talking about persecution. As they treated me, as they persecuted me, they will persecute you. Again, so those of us who are Christians in this country for a long time have enjoyed we've been in the cultural majority. We haven't had to endure a lot of persecution. I think that's changing. We saw the way the government treated a lot of churches during COVID. That was a shift. But I do think, in a sense, when we feel like we're out of step with the culture, we feel that tension, Joseph, I think that we should expect that because at the end of the day, being a Christian, being a follower of Jesus is not going to necessarily be with the majority. It's not going to be with the crowd.
That's exactly right. And Jesus would not have spent as much time as he did telling us how to respond when people mistreat us if he did not expect people to mistreat us. So it's one of those situations where we can, when it happens, he's equipped us for those moments. So a follow-up question to that then is, to what extent should Christians try to fit in these situations?
I think one thing I would say, this goes back to a comment you made a moment ago. We should be winsome. We've talked about this. We don't want to go looking to pick a fight or to be, to agitate someone. Ephesians 4:5, it's a verse I've quoted before with you talking about these issues. Christians ought to be the people who speak the truth in love. And so I think we need to realize we need to hold both of those. I think sometimes we're tempted we just want to be so loving that we never speak up. We never say that we feel uncomfortable, or there's some Christians who can, be all truth, all conviction, all propositional truth. And as Christians, I think we need to really make sure we're searching our hearts, we're searching our motivations, we're searching our spirits, but we need to lean into both of those. We need to be people who don't give an inch. I think that's a phrase you used in the article we have on the website. We can't give an inch. We can't back down. But I think we can do so in a kind and loving way. We should be, after all, Joseph, the people who embody the fruit of the Spirit. But even as we're embodying the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, and kindness, goodness, and gentleness, we should also be people rooted in convictional truth.
Perhaps my favorite biblical illustration or a story that kind of applies to this is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And I assume I've talked about this before, but they faced a very similar scenario. And most people in the audience are going to be familiar with this story. But Nebuchadnezzar wanted them to bow to an idol as a way of showing their loyalty to him, the king. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego could not do so. They were Jewish, and they had they knew very clearly the Ten Commandments told them to have no other gods besides Yahweh. They weren't going to be bowing to other idols. But when I put myself in that situation, I feel like I could justify a small little compromise as a way of saving my life, right? I mean, it's a bow. God knows it in my heart. I'm not really worshiping the statue, but I mean, for heaven's sake, we don't want to be incinerated, do we, right? God will surely understand this situation. But I think there's a biblical principle there that we don't compromise even on the small things. And we know how God redeemed that situation. But even for those of us who are not being threatened immediately with a fiery furnace and being threatened with incineration, there's a practical truth here as well. It's because if you do give an inch, if you compromise even a little bit to their demands, all that does is incentivize more bullying. You will not discourage the harassment. You will only incentivize it because they sense the weakness. So if you draw your line in the sand, plant your flag, say, this is who I am, I'm not moving anywhere. Eventually they have to move on because they know you can't be moved. But once they realize you can be moved, the pressure to move you will only increase. So I think you only do yourselves favors when you draw your line in the sand. You let the whole world know this is who I am. This is what I am about. And you move on much more quickly when you do that. But David, I want to get into the next question here, because in this conversation and in so many others around cultural issues, the culture war issues, Christians are accused of being too negative. And I think this is one of those situations where, you're just against things. You're just against gay people. You're just against happiness. What's your response to the idea that Christians are just opposed to everything?
Yeah, I'd say we need to go back and actually read our Bibles, because sure, there are sins, Joseph, that we are against. We're against pride. We're against lust. We're against gluttony. But the Bible presents a compelling vision for God's design for marriage and for sexuality. Right now, I'm working on a curriculum that FRC is going to be publishing in the fall. And it's just amazing returning to those verses, Joseph, in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. God's design, his plan for marriage is one that is beautiful. And the way the Scripture explains this, and obviously sin comes in Genesis 3, and we live in a fallen world. But again, we are pro marriage. We are pro the thriving and flourishing that comes from that. And God is so gracious in His Word to tell us that when we depart from His plan, there are consequences. And so, yes, I think Christians, we can put a positive spin on what we are for, and then what we can lovingly do is say that God's Word tells us that if we step outside the bounds, the guardrail, so to speak, then negative things happen for us, for those in society. And so, yes, we need to have a clear sexual ethic that is clear on what is outside of the bounds. But I do think, Joseph, we can present a compelling picture for what God is pro. He's pro-marriage. He's pro our thriving within the context that He set up for us.
That's exactly right. And I think it's important for people to understand that necessarily, just logically, whenever you say no to something, you're saying yes to something else. Whenever you say yes to something, you're saying no to its opposite or an alternative. And when Christians say no to doing whatever we want sexually, it's because we're saying yes to fulfilling the design that God put in us biologically, physiologically, even to connect with one person sexually. And that's our bodies are designed. The hormones that cause that to happen. When we say no to children being created through surrogacy situations and given to two men to raise them, it's not because we hate those two men. It's because we're saying yes to the idea that every child deserves to know and be loved by its mother and father. And that's going to be the best situation for that child. So I encourage everybody, as you're listening, remember the things that you're saying yes to. Remember the alternatives to what the culture is proposing. And if we can articulate those things, we will have much more successful interactions and conversations. And finally, David, we've got just under a minute left. But if people face the pressure, if they face the heat, if they face the insults, what's the right way to respond in that moment?
Yeah, Joseph, we got to do it in truth and love. But at the end of the day, the way you end the show every Friday, we need to fear God and nothing else. And I think that's the conviction that we need to have in our spines on this issue and all others.
That you've already ended it for me, but I'm going to have to do it again myself, David. But thank you so much for your time. And I'll encourage people also to pray for those who persecute you. Actually go to prayer on behalf of the people that you have those difficult conversations with.